Jacob Edwards Library. We are thrilled this evening to have Meghan MacLean Weir here with us, who is an author of 2 books, and this is her debut novel that she is speaking about this evening, which is called The Book of Essie. And I'll just read a little from the flyleaf. A captivating debut novel of family, fame and religion. The Book of Essie tells the story of the 17-year-old daughter of an evangelical preacher, star of the family hit reality show, and the secret pregnancy that threatens to blow her entire world apart. So that's the cliffhanger. But this is her second book, as I mentioned. Dr. MacLean Weir is a physician in the Boston area, and she has also written a non-fiction book. So without further ado, I think I will allow Meghan to tell her story. But we're thrilled that she's back in Southbridge, as she has spent almost 10 years, I believe, here in the area and continued afterwards at summer camp. So she's very familiar with this neck of the woods. So we'd like to give a warm welcome to Meghan MacLean Weir this evening.
Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see everyone, and it's wonderful to be back in Southbridge. If you'll permit me, I have just 2 very vivid memories of this library. And so the first is that this is where I did my first summer reading. And one of the first summers, every time you read a book, you got a leaf, and then it was put up on this tree on the wall, and you would write your name on it so that people could see that you had done it. And I was like determined to like cover everyone else's up and have read like the most books. And then another of my very vivid memories is sort of a childhood friend was walking through town. I was on the way to the library with my mom, and we were like about to wave and say hi to this friend of ours who was with a family member. And I think she was probably being a bit fresh, and she bit her family member. And that family member turned right around and bit her right back. And my mother and I did one of these and just kept going. But that became one of the moments where, like, for years afterward, if I was getting uppity with my mom and she had sent me to my room and I was doing one of those, the world is not fair, you're so awful, she would just sort of shrug and say, at least I didn't bite you. And so I grew up in the rectory that was owned by Holy Trinity Episcopal Church, where my dad was the priest, right on the corner of South Street, and went to West Street School for many years. And then my dad was given an opportunity to switch jobs, and we moved to Buffalo, New York. And I remember sort of getting on the Pike and having it turn into the New York State Thruway, and my mother's like look on her face was just like we were leaving Massachusetts, and Buffalo was still hours and hours away, and I think she just couldn't believe that she had gone so far from home. And so I was instructed throughout all of my years of high school, and to be honest, was incredibly lucky with my education and the sort of community that we found in Buffalo. But I was always under orders to move back to Massachusetts just as soon as I could. And when I applied to college, I did apply to lots of schools in Massachusetts, and we were sort of, all of the offers were on the table, and there were some wonderful colleges that did not give me any financial aid, and I knew that like I couldn't do that. And I almost apologized to my parents when I had decided to go to school in New Jersey. And they said, you know what, it's okay. It's only 4 years. You can move to Massachusetts afterwards. And so it didn't work out to move right back to Massachusetts, but I was lucky enough after medical school to be able to come back and to do my training at Boston Medical Center, and Boston Children's Hospital has a combined program that's just wonderful. And when you're thinking about sort of how to train doctors, putting them in sort of not only those academic institutions that are sort of world-renowned, but also those city hospitals, community hospitals that really are the backbone of providing healthcare to communities. It was such a wonderful opportunity. Let me just tell you briefly, if I may, how I decided to write a book. Because I think a lot of people who love literature and love reading and writing find that that's the thing that they're most curious about. Some people in this room know my mother, and she is a lovely woman who I think sort of at a time when she was employed outside of the home in a way that was not common for a priest's wife to be at that time or of that generation. She was sort of groundbreaking in a way that I didn't appreciate at the time. And she felt very, very strongly about education and how important it is and was for both myself and my brother growing up. And she felt very strongly about the arts, and I just remember sort of like marching outside of Buffalo City Hall in favor of funding for music and the arts and literature in our schools. And you can't find a more passionate advocate for music and art than my mom. But I knew from my mom that none of those were acceptable career choices. That it was wonderful if you wanted to sing or do theater, but that you were never going to make a living doing any of those things, and so you should be prepared to be a music teacher or a theater teacher. And that it was wonderful if you wanted to write, but that was certainly not going to pay the bills, and so you should be prepared to be an English teacher if you wanted to be a writer. And so I sort of internalized that, and she's horrified now that that was the lesson that I took away from my upbringing. But I really felt sort of going through college that I needed to sort of have a job that was going to pay. And I was somebody who sort of enjoyed science and was passionate about science. And as a young woman in the field, I felt sort of obligated to sort of represent the STEM fields for women. And so decided to go into medicine because I don't think I would have survived in a lab for any length of time trying to get a PhD. I did some research over one summer at Princeton, and I was reading War and Peace at the time, which was a mistake, and so I was doing these gels where you sort of run proteins to separate them, purify your sample, and that takes hours and hours of your time, and then you've got this precious tiny little blue dyed sample, and you pipette it into this little well, and then you set up the electric current and everything sort of separates, and you stop it in time before everything runs off of the gel and into the liquid bath that it's bathing in. And I kept just not doing that because I was reading War and Peace, and it's long, and you have to keep going. And so I kept having to redo my research over and over again, at which point I realized that I was probably not cut out for bench work. And I was lucky enough to have very supportive staff at my medical school because I had this idea going into medical school that I should write a novel. And I would love to tell you that it came from a more logical place than it did, but really all I remember is that I was walking across my college campus and it was beautiful. And there were some trees and they were flowering, and I was like, I should write a book. And I should do that before I'm 25. And I don't know why I thought that was a good idea, but I kept thinking that, and it sort of carried it with me. And at any of the points at which sort of other people would have sat down to write said book, I didn't. I majored in science. I was taking a bunch of science classes. I applied to medical school. The gentleman who lived across the hall from me my freshman year had disappeared on some strange adventure that summer, had come back, and he, in fact, did write a novel called Everything is Illuminated, and Jonathan Safran Foer went on to write several other books. And I think I didn't quite get that you were supposed to sit down and write. And I just remember he got in very big trouble with our fire marshals because he had hung like these butterflies from the ceiling in his room, and they were deemed a fire hazard. And in my head, I thought that's what you did to write a novel, that you're just like kind of quirky and artistic. But I didn't really see the time invested because I didn't know him that well. We like met outside the bathroom, waved hi, goodbye. And then years later, I was watching TV with my then boyfriend, now husband, and he came on the television. I was like, I think I know that guy. And my husband's like, stop trying to sound important. Like, I don't know that guy. And I was like, no, seriously, I do. And then they said his name, and I realized that he was the guy with the butterflies. And so I carried around this idea that I should write a book. But the thing about medical school is that when you finish, you go on to residency, and you have to be a doctor and take care of patients. And that is quite rightly a full-time job. And so I got myself into a bit of a panic, sort of my third year of medical school, because I realized that if I didn't try to write this book that I had for some reason decided to write, that I was never going to get to. And so I did what any type A crazy person would do. I did not go to my dean and say, listen, I would like a year off because I would like to try to write a novel. I realized that I would have a blank space on my resume if I did that. So instead I applied for a master's program in medical anthropology at Oxford University, and went to my dean and say, hey, I've gotten into this master's program in England. Could I have time off to do that? And they said, by all means, that would be great. And I thought, I can do enough work on the master's to just sort of keep up, and then I will also write a novel. And so I moved to England, in large part because it was where my parents had spent their first married year together. My dad was at Balliol College, I was at Green Templeton. Met this guy from Worcester College, and ended up marrying him. So it's ultimately a good thing that I went abroad. But I did find that compared to the workload of medical school and clinical rotations, that there was plenty of time to sort of do both, and have a courtship at the same time. And so I had a wonderful experience in the medical anthropology program there, which was sort of a burgeoning field of social anthropologists who primarily look at culture and how we sort of understand health in our bodies, and physical anthropologists who are very interested in sort of measurable anthropometrics, like how much do you weigh and how tall are you if you have X, Y, or Z nutrition. And so, it was a field that was still finding its feet and its balance, and it was wonderful to be a part of at the time. And I was given an opportunity as part of my studies to travel to South Africa, where I'd been one time previously during medical school, to sort of shadow and mentor with some folks who work in what they call AIDS orphanages, or programs for children who've been orphaned by the HIV/AIDS epidemic, many of whom are HIV positive themselves. And so I wrote a novel about a medical student who goes to a village like that, and about how very quickly she realizes that she just has no knowledge or skills applicable to help this global pandemic. And I came back, Googled, how do you find an agent? Or how do you publish a book? Because I didn't even know literary agents were a thing. And realized I needed to have an agent. Googled some agents, found a woman whose daughter was named Ali Sheedy and was in the Breakfast Club, and I thought she must be a nice person. And so again, not necessarily making the most logical decisions, but it seemed to work. And so I got in touch with her and sent her the first chapters of the book, and she offered to represent me, which was incredibly nice of her. Good news for the world, bad news for my manuscript is that many of the drugs that had not been available in sub-Saharan Africa very shortly after that became generic and were rolled out across all of these communities that had had no access to antiretrovirals previously. And so the entire plot of that novel no longer made any sense. And so I put it aside and figured that maybe someday I could fix it. But in the interim, I had started writing some stories about residency. That became my first book, which I think sort of ridiculously is called a memoir, because I hadn't really done very much of anything at that point in my life. But it was good for me to have a record for what those years were and were not, and sort of my shortcomings, and the system's shortcomings in terms of sort of training new doctors. And I had a conversation sort of right before that book came out with one of my mentors at Boston Children's Hospital. And I was trying to figure out if I was going to stay there, if I was going to move on and take a job elsewhere, and if I stayed, what might my job look like. And he said, you know, Megan, you really have to, if you're going to stay, you have to make yourself worthwhile. Like, you have to have a special skill. Like, these two girls that you know, these two women, lovely lady doctors, have been doing this quality improvement initiative, and these folks are working on residency education. You know, what do you bring to the table? And I said, well, Vinny, I just wrote this book, and it's going to be published like in an actual book, form. And I'd like to do more writing, and I think, sort of talking about medical writing with the residents would be really helpful. And he just shook his head at me and said, Megan, it's Harvard. Everyone has a book. And I did not cry in front of him, but I, felt all of my pride and joy sort of flushing away. And I left that meeting. I did take a job at Children's, and I stayed on, and have stayed on for many years. But never felt like that was going to be an outlet that the hospital in particular was interested in, which is fair. And so if the hospital was not interested, why not write a novel? Because that's much more fun. And why not have it not be medical? Because, if you spend all your time in the hospital, the last thing you really want to do is think more about medicine when you go home. And so I, at that point, my parents had moved in with my husband and myself. We had bought a multifamily, and my mom had very graciously agreed to do our childcare. And so I was spending a lot more time with my parents than I think a lot of adult people do. And I was thinking back on just what it meant to me to be my parents' child growing up. And I know that every child feels scrutinized by adults at some point or another. But it was particularly interesting for me to live in a small town like this one, where pretty much everyone knew my dad. My dad, even if he didn't know people, would pretend to know people. And so he gave the impression that everybody knew us. And it felt very much like if I stepped out of line, it would get back to my mom very quickly. And that's fine. I'm not, traumatized, and had a lovely upbringing. But it did sort of raise the question for me, what would that be like if it were a little bit more malicious or felt that way? And that's sort of where the Book of Essie came from initially, this idea of what it would be like to be a young woman, in a community where everybody knew her and ostensibly loved her and was supportive of her. But if they didn't have her best interests at heart, and if they weren't standing up for her, what would it take for her to need to be able to reach out for help? And so the Book of Essie, in its earliest form, really was just an idea of this young girl asking a reporter for help. And I had that scene, which ended up being in the 3rd chapter, very clearly in my mind. And then from there, there's a scene at the end of the church, at the end of the book, on the steps of the church, where sort of everything falls apart. And in writing the book, I really just wanted to get from that first, kernel of human interaction and her taking a risk on someone else, and get her to the point where she was standing up and fighting for her freedom. So if it's okay, I'll read just a little bit from the beginning. And then I should just say that Esther, who I think is just a wonderful heroine, I would love to be friends with her. I would love to have my daughter be friends with her. I didn't think she was going to know enough to be able to tell the story in its entirety. And so she shares the narration with a young man named Roarke Richards, who she also reaches out to for help, and Liberty Bell, who is the journalist that she approaches for help. But this is Essie at the beginning. On the day I turned 17, there is a meeting to decide whether I should have the baby or if sneaking me to a clinic for an abortion is worth the PR risk. I'm not invited, which is just as well, since my being there might imply that I have some choice in the matter, and I know that I have none. I listen in, though, the way Lissa and I used to before she went away. It was Lissa who discovered the vent in the wall of the laundry room, who realized that you could eavesdrop on everything that was said in the production office if you climbed onto the dryer and put your ear up against the filigreed bronze grate. The winter Lissa broke her leg, she was 14 and I was 9. I remember she chose an orange cast that Mother hated, and the doctor laughed and said something about Lissa being a firecracker, and Mother frowned but didn't dare to disagree, not with the cameras rolling. I could tell she was worried that the color was too bright, that it would bleed on screen or at the very least be distracting. It lasted only a second, the withering look she shot my sister, as the fiberglass was unwrapped and wound round and round the crack above Lissa's ankle. But even at 9, I was well versed in Mother's methods of wordless communication. I knew exactly what to look for, just as I knew to look for the flash of defiance in Lissa's eyes that was my sister's only reply. The doctor signed the cast when he was done, and so did all the nurses. Then Lissa and I were given popsicles for the ride home. They were orange to match the cast, but Mother made us throw them in the trash as soon as we reached the parking lot. She said the sugar would ruin our teeth, but I think really she did it just to punish us, to remind Lissa that she shouldn't count on the cameras for protection, that they might delay the consequences of her actions, but would never entirely prevent them. She needn't have bothered. It was the first lesson any of us learned. That cast was the reason it became my job to climb up and report everything the grown-ups said, because Lissa couldn't do it herself without breaking the only good leg she had left. It's possible that without that orange cast, Lissa would never have told me about the vent at all. Since trusting me was a risk, she might have kept the secret to herself, ferreting away this little piece of knowledge the way she used to hide the chocolate bars she stole from Stahl's sweet shop when she stopped in with Becca Twomey on their way home from school. Lissa never bought anything, but Becca was allowed to spend her allowance on whatever she wanted. In any case, that was how it seemed. Lissa and I, on the other hand, were allowed chocolate only on birthdays and Easter. I always wondered after she was gone, and I found the box of unopened candy under her bed, why she bothered to steal it at all, why she took such a risk. If she had been found out, it wouldn't have been only Daddy's paddle she'd have had to contend with. Mother's silent punishment would have been much worse. It meant something, I realized, that Lissa could sneak the Milky Ways into her bag without Mr. Stahl noticing, yet never bring herself to open them. Eating the chocolate, I saw much later on, would have been the thing that made the stealing real. The dryer is running and slightly warm when I sit on it. It's a pleasant sensation, but the clang of some sort of metal clip getting thwapped against the drum covers up the sound of the producer speaking on the other side of the wall, so I turn the dryer off. Once the drum has stopped turning, I can hear well enough to make out what Candy is saying. The name fits her. Sweet as sugar, but hard enough to break a tooth on. She has been with us since before I was born, since that first Christmas special when Maddie was not quite 3 and my parents had just been told that there would be no more children. Daddy had spent so much time on television by then, you'd have thought it would have come naturally. But Mother said he was as nervous as a pig in a bacon factory the day the new crew started filming. Up until then, the cameras had only been at church, where they were entirely under Daddy's control. Could he tell then that the balance of power was subtly shifting? In any case, Mother had to force Daddy to let the crew into his house, and even then, he did this thing where he scratched his wrist incessantly any time the cameras were pointed at him. Candy's team did their best to edit this out, to use the close-ups of his pensive expression and his clear blue eyes, but there are a few shots where you can see him moving his fingers back and forth compulsively, as if possessed, like an addict scratching at invisible bugs burrowing just beneath his skin. Mother stole the show, though, so it didn't matter. She cried real tears when she revealed their struggles to conceive, their disappointment. She was candid when she confessed that they had always wanted a big family, a brood, a flock, to tend and raise up in His grace and light. After all, if children are a gift from God, surely Daddy was deserving of more than just a single blessing, since he had made it his life's work to speak His truth and praise His name, even in these darkest days. She sighed and reached out and took my father's hand, then stilled it and held it tight to keep him from scratching. With her eyes turned up to the ceiling, the tears welled at first but did not fall. Then Mother looked directly at the camera and breathed something about accepting God's will, and those fat drops rolled right down her tastefully rouged cheeks as if she had control over gravity itself. That hour-long special probably would have just been a one-off, since Daddy said the focus should be on his ministry, not on his family. But on Christmas Eve, they found out that Daniel was on the way, and people called it an honest-to-God miracle. And there was no stopping after that. 9 months later, when my brother was born, 10 million people tuned in to see it happen. Not the actual moment, of course, but everything leading up to it. The praying, the hand-holding, the reciting of bits of verse. Then he was lifted, slick and shrieking and still streaked with blood. And Daddy let loose a heartfelt alleluia, and a regular television phenomenon was born. When I was growing up, I never really wondered why the show became so popular. Contrary to what some left-wing bloggers might say, this wasn't because I'm at all conceited. It was because I lacked perspective. Mother said we were called to lead by example, and the capital C hung in the air like something holy, so I believed her. I didn't know any better. Other families had enjoyed their 15 minutes of fame, their moment in the spotlight, only to have their shows canceled after a few seasons, when the parents divorced or the child who was adorable at age 4 became positively homely at 7, or failed to outgrow a lisp. Or maybe, for no discernible reason at all, the audience simply grew bored, and advertising revenue dried up. Then the camera crews would pack up their things and retreat, leaving the house feeling empty, the living room slightly too large, the rooms eerily quiet. Or so I always assumed. I took it for granted, I guess, that we were special. We were chosen, or at the very least, odd enough to be intriguing to those who continued to tune in season after season, year after year, because they did tune in. They watched Daniel take his first steps, saw Maddie cut his knee when he fell off his bike, and cried along with him when he got stitches. They saw Daddy and Mother move into the new house, the one the church built for us, the week before Jacob was due. They marveled at Mother's cool exterior, the calm she exuded in the eye of the storm created by those whirling dervishes who were her many sons, for by then she was vastly outnumbered. Daddy, Maddie, Daniel, and Jacob had been joined by Caleb. Then came Elizabeth, the girl my parents and the nation as a whole had been waiting for. Then triplets, 2 more girls and a boy, who were born much too early, and whose short existence was chronicled and broadcast live from the private room in the neonatal intensive care unit, where their 3 isolettes stood under constant guard. Looking weary but dogged, Mother would lift the thick quilted coverings that encased these strange plastic pods to reveal the closed eyes or purple waxy toes of Mary or Ruth or Zechariah, each of them with tubes disappearing into their mouths and plunged into their belly buttons, dependent upon the machines that pushed air into their tiny undeveloped lungs or dripped sugar and fat into their blood. Those weeks the show got the best ratings it ever had, though some said the exploitation of such sick, helpless infants went too far, crossed some invisible line drawn in the sand. Mother was not one to apologize, however, and though people started to petition and vowed to boycott the funeral episode, no one actually did. That month, a photograph of those 3 miniature caskets lined up side by side in a sea of roses made it onto the cover of Time. There was a break then from the making of more babies. It was just as well. After the triplets, the fans had lost their stomach for such things. Apart from a few miscarriages, after each of which the doctors again said that Mother would never be able to bear another child, the show shifted its focus to Maddie and Daniel, then 10 and 8, who begged Mother to let them go to public school rather than be taught at home. They asked for and received a puppy, a golden retriever named Blister, who shed on the carpet but redeemed himself by learning to catch a frisbee and retrieve a ball. These were some of the most boring episodes, but there was a war on at the time, one of those unnamed conflicts in the Middle East, so the mundanity of it all was probably soothing. Anyway, this sort of thing carried them through until Lissa was nearly 6, and I was born, wholly unexpectedly. Another miracle of a sort, a reward for those fans who had stayed loyal for so long. I'll stop there.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
I am capable of just rambling on, and I'm happy to do so, but I think at this point it probably makes the most sense to open it up for some questions, and then I can ramble in a directed fashion.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Can I just make one mention,
Yes.
which I was remiss in not mentioning at the introduction, that it's thanks to Nancy Harwood that I was made aware of your novel and how nice, how wonderful a book it was. And I would like to thank Nancy publicly for that, because it would have maybe we already had the book in our collection, but it had gone right by me without seeing the Southbridge connection. And I think that's really endears us more to the book, as well as the fact that it stands on its own merit. So if people would like to ask some questions, I think Meghan is interested in talking.
Hi, Larry.
Hi.
I just wanted to say that the stigma about getting a real job, and you say you're going to be an actress, actor, or author, has not gone. It's not just for women; it's for everybody.
Yeah.
If you say you're going to major in something, I'm going to be in theater, and what are you going to do for a living? Always is right there. It's like, yeah, you're going to be a writer, and it's the stigma is there with everybody. It's still there.
Yeah, and
if you're going to be an artist, God forbid.
Yeah.
But I have been, incredibly impressed with the folks in my life who have managed to balance sort of a career that pays the bills with still doing community theater and performing. I have a friend from summer camp in this area. I think he grew up in Westboro, but he is a performer. He's a kindergarten teacher by day, and then by weekend he does sort of singing, dancing shows for kids' music. He writes songs and he does birthday parties, and I think that when I went into medicine, that first day that we were sort of orienting for residency, they said to us, you come from a lot of backgrounds and you come to us specifically at this institution, because we were impressed with sort of the broadness of your interests and what you bring to the field, but now stop that. Because you don't have time for any of those interests anymore. And so they said, we're excited about all of your paths and your resumes, but for these next 3 years, you really need to concentrate on medicine, and then you can pick one other thing. And that one other thing, obviously, should be, sort of seeing your family at some point. And I think that at that point, I had the manuscript sort of floating around from the first novel I'd written, and I knew that I wasn't going to have the time to revisit it. I did some edits, but I wasn't able to sort of rewrite it to the lengths that it needed to become something that made commercial sense, or even actual sense, since the medicine behind it had changed so much at that time. But I knew that one thing's not enough for anyone, I don't think. And so, I think that it's not at all to belittle sort of the training that medical doctors go through. And I put in the hours and I did the time. But I don't think you're feeding yourself as a provider, as a human being, if you're sort of not allowing yourself to have interests outside of the hospital. And specifically as a pediatrician, nobody trusted my judgment until I had kids myself. And then all of a sudden I was an expert. But I had been doing it for years before I had my own kids. But then to be able to say, oh yeah, that sucks. I'm really, really sorry. You're going to be up all night with this, coughing and snotty kid. But that they're okay. It means a lot more coming from a parent, I think, than from somebody sort of fresh out of training who doesn't know what they're talking about. So I think it does a disservice to not only medicine, but lots of other fields if they, are limiting their professionals to sort of have very narrow viewpoints. And so I was incredibly lucky to be given the time. When I wrote the book during residency, I was given some weeks off here and there, and they were able to do that for me. As they had done for lots of other candidates, like PhD candidates, would still have some research they needed to do, and they would sort of say, listen, I need some more time to go back to my lab to get this journal article ready. Can we change my residency schedule? And it was fascinating to me, though, because when I talked about getting an alternate schedule for residency in order to write the book, there was a lot of judgment in people who thought it was ridiculous that the residency should have to accommodate me for something so strange or bizarre or something that I wanted to do, when in fact residencies make those accommodations all the time. And I think writing a book is just as valuable as writing a paper for Cell or Nature. or sitting in a lab somewhere. And I think we need to acknowledge that medicine in particular and all fields are better off when the folks who are working in them are, well-rounded.
First of all, thank you for the book. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful read, but what really astonishes me now, all other questions flew out of my head. I can't believe, my mother was a doctor here in town as well, and she went through medical school shortly after World War II, so it was a whole different game. But I cannot imagine that you wrote a book during the residency from all the stories and the war stories I've heard. That must have been just grueling.
So I don't know that I wrote it during residency.
Or during your...
But I wrote it concurrently with it. And so I knew when they gave me a few weeks off that I had to sort of sit down and do it. And I think, memoirs or narrative nonfiction about sort of being a doctor, often it's about just amazing, wonderful folks and sort of spans years of their careers. But there is this little niche field of sort of, like the House of God kind of trial by fire. And I spoke with some other folks who had written books like that, and no one had sort of been writing during. They had sort of maybe kept journals during, but none of those books were a production of a resident. They were a production of sort of an attending physician who was then looking back on those years. And so I finished the book during my residency, and I sent it off. And toward the end, I was sending off chapters to my agent, and she said, good, thanks, great. And then sort of in the third year, I think she started to get nervous, and she said, so you're going to have to just like tie everything up and leave the reader with a feeling of hope. And I was like, well, I will do that when I feel some hope. And I think when you're truly that tired, and I started my residency, people outside of the medical field don't need to know this, but when I started my residency, the Bell Commission, which was sort of formed after a young girl in New York died, and maybe wouldn't have died if people had had more sleep and were more aware, and at her bedside faster. Put a limit on residency work hours. So we could only work 30 hours at a time in a stretch. So we could go into work, be there overnight, and then we were supposed to leave midway through the day. And previously, people had stayed that whole day after they were on call. And I think legitimately the acuity and the number of people on services had been lower. And so residents, they were residents of the hospital. They lived in the hospital. They were getting some sleep at night, and that has changed. And so partway through my last year, we switched to a night shift system, which is still not good. And it involves more handoffs, but at least you're on for 12 or 18 hours or whatever. But it's hard, and I think that, this idea of folks in medicine really wanting to make the right decisions for their patients, they don't always remember what it felt like when they were a trainee. And so I think it was useful to write the book as I was going. I have not read it since. I read it a bunch of times when the copy editors were sending me sort of the notes and fixing my commas, etc. But I haven't picked it up just to read it because I don't really want to spend time with the person I was back then. And I think it's useful for folks going into medicine to sort of know how it feels. Up until then, you worked hard, you study enough to be able to do well on the test, and there's just no way to know if you're up for the task of whatever's going to come up in a given shift, which I think is, hopefully, if you're going to become a good doctor, it makes you learn how to ask for help very quickly. And if you don't learn that skill, and if you don't learn how much the nurses are actually in charge of everything, then things don't go well for you. But if you learn to ask for help, then you learn a lot faster and you are much more efficient.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I can't often say I just couldn't put the book down, but I couldn't put the book down. And for a variety of reasons. One, I just was fascinated with the whole thing with this family being part of a weekly show, you know, what reality TV. I don't like reality TV, so I haven't ever seen it.
Neither do I.
And but I was fascinated by it because I've often wondered about people and how could they allow their whole family and their children to be, you know, a part of that. And so you brought out a lot of the, I think, psychological things that were going on there, but also as a marriage and family therapist, and I've worked with so many people who have experienced incest, and so I was just the whole time like cheering Essie on, and you know, just so excited when she found her voice, and work through that whole stuff that anybody with that experience does. If I let the secret out, is this going to destroy my family? Is this what's going to happen? And you know, it's just such real stuff that's going on around us all the time, even if people aren't aware of that. And I thought you handled it so beautifully.
Thank you. I think, you know, sort of, I think of writing as being an extension of what I do for my patients when I'm at work. And one of my biggest fears, I now work in the emergency department and have for many years, but one of my biggest fears is that somebody will come in because they sort of bumped their knee, but really what they're doing there is they're there because they are looking for help.
Yeah.
And in the first page of the book, Lisa breaks her leg, and they go and the doctor takes care of her, and that doctor, you know, is not seen in the rest of the novel, but that doctor is there because he failed. He failed those young women. And he had an opportunity to ask the right questions, and he didn't. And that's not to necessarily put blame on him specifically, but I think we as a community need to be asking the right questions, and we need to sort of be presenting ourselves as open and supportive of young people, especially because they haven't necessarily found their voices, but of all of our community members, so that when awful things are happening, there's no question that somebody would stand up for you. And so, you know, I take care of a lot of young women who come in. The ER has become a place for mental health services, which is not good for mental health services and not good for the ER, but it's sort of the system that we're stuck with. And so, you know, for people who say something about wanting to hurt themselves or feeling depressed, they'll often end up in the emergency room and just sort of stuck for many hours. And I always felt like if the young woman in question had a book and was reading, like that was a sign to me that she was going to be okay. Mm-hmm. That, you know, if you're in your depths of depression, you can't really sort of get out of your own head or have the energy to do anything. But if she was sitting there reading a book, I was like, oh, she'll be okay. And there was a period of time where everyone was reading The Hunger Games. And, you know, I am very familiar with Dora the Explorer and like all of the Disney shows. And I can, you know, play a mean Disney princess and sing all the songs when I'm like sewing up cuts. And it keeps the little ones calm, but I didn't really have sort of a connection with the teenage parent or teenage patients other than just being nice. But I thought, I'm going to read Hunger Games, and then I'm going to be cool. And they are going to get me and get that I get them. And so I read The Hunger Games, and like the first time a young person came in, like reading it, I like was all over that. I was like, so Katniss. And like there was just the most epic eye roll. Because it wasn't my book to talk about, it was their book. And so, you know, the other thing that I wanted to do in writing this story was to have a young enough protagonist that it would appeal to those older teenage patients of mine who I think really, you know, could use literature that encourages and celebrates sort of honesty and people standing up for themselves. But also was written from a more adult perspective in Libby, so that the book belonged equally to different generations, so that we could sort of discuss. And it's been just so wonderful to see, you know, the feedback from folks who are passing their book on to a friend or a family member, or a niece or a nephew, because they don't want to discriminate against the young men. But you know, to sort of feel like not only that they enjoyed the book, but they need someone else to read it now so that they can talk about it. And so, yeah, I never had any doubt that she would be brave in the end, because that's what I would want for my daughter. The novel, My Absolute Darling, has anyone read that? It's by Gabrielle Tallant. Not sure if I'm saying that right, but it's about sort of an abusive father-daughter relationship. And it's very hard to read, and I have a pretty high threshold, and I don't give trigger warnings, but this one deserves a trigger warning. And it was just, you know, it's a story about abuse in all of its just most ugly forms. But it's a beautiful book. And if you can tolerate it, I think it has a lot of wonderful lessons. But I didn't want this book to be that book. I wanted this book to be about someone who was sort of past a horrible experience and sort of taking the next steps to the future. Yeah. Other question?
What does the future hold? What are you planning in terms of your writing? Would you like to address that?
Yeah, so I was able to sort of cut down my hours in the hospital because time is not infinite, and I feel like I've been given a gift in a lot of ways, and having the support of my agent and Knopf in particular, the folks there, my editor Jenny Jackson is just amazing. And so I would like to be able to hand them something. And so I've been working in the hospital a bit less, and put my foot down and said I'm not working any more weekends or evenings, which they were not too pleased about. And I'm seeing in my paycheck. It's okay, at least in the short term. And I am a much happier person. A lot of my job happened after midnight. Up until now, and it's much better to sleep in your own bed every night. And so I am working on a story that I actually started writing even before I got an offer on this, and I wrote a full manuscript, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen at the end, so I just made a bunch of stuff up, because it's fiction, you can do that. And it didn't make sense. And so my agent very rightly, I think, said, like, what is this? And said, I really like this, and these characters, but what happened at the end? And I said, I don't know, I was just trying to finish it in time, because my editor at that time was hugely pregnant, and there had been sort of like this push to try to get it done before she had the baby, which, I mean, happened, it just wasn't any good. And so we chatted, and I went back to the drawing board and had some more ideas, and had a bunch of characters that I just really enjoyed, and I sent him sort of half of a draft, and he was like, this is just so much, and I was like, yeah, and he's like, why don't we both think about this for a few days? And I said, okay. And then I wrote him an email, and I said, you know, I think I might be writing 2 different books, and he was like, yeah, that's probably true. He's like, but I didn't want to be the one to say it.
That's great.
And so I put, you know, sort of half the characters aside and have been focusing on the other half. And so it's 4 friends from college who, years later, one of their husbands has been killed in a hate crime. And so she is trying to put herself back together. She's a physician, and, you know, sort of has fled the country to work in different parts of the world so that she doesn't have to deal with life, and sort of how her friends rally around her, and ultimately maybe find out who killed him.
That sounds wonderful.
So, one step at a time. Yeah.
If your editor ever goes on maternity leave, may I recommend my sister-in-law? Editorial services.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, she's back, and the baby is gorgeous.
Well, if she ever goes again.
Yeah. She may. I mean, she's got 2 now, and I I stopped it too, because I thought if I was outnumbered, that it would get even worse for me, since they seem to be running the show, despite being children. Knopf has been very, very kind to me. And this cover is gorgeous. And so it's such a funny story, because when the galleys, the advance copies went out, it just had this blue cover. And I have a friend who works at a bookstore nearby, and she said, well, I got it. And like, I almost didn't pick it up, because I figure when the cover's not done by the time they send out the galley, they must not care enough to get it done. And I was like, no, I mean, the opposite was true for Essie. They were carrying around pictures of potential covers like throughout their offices, and people were saying like, yeah, it's good, but it's not the best, or it doesn't move me. And so this cover was ultimately designed by Abby Weintraub, who did the cover for Station 11, based on a photograph taken by Sarah Tour, who's a photographer that I've connected with on Instagram, and it's just, I think this was her first book cover, and it was my first novel, so then we were both pretty thrilled. And it's just so much fun to see all of the folks who go into making this possible. Because I think we think of, anytime you're trying to break into an industry, whether it's writing, or theoretically, I've had some chats with folks in LA, who sort of do media acquisitions and sort of think about television or movies, and no one I've talked to has been anything but excited for telling stories and getting stories to the people who love them, in whatever form that takes. And that's just wonderful. Nobody told me there's a job where you read books and decide if they should become movies or television. And if I had known that, maybe I would have made different life choices. But there are so many books so many jobs that exist in this industry that are just filled by wonderful people. I just feel lucky to work with them, and just trying to pick their brains and take all of the knowledge I can from this experience.
That's wonderful.
Yes?
I'm curious, how did you actually connect with your editor and publisher?
Yeah, so once you've got an agent, they do all of that for you.
How did you connect with the agent?
Yeah, so I Googled different agents back in the day, and sort of done the snail mail thing with a manuscript from England, where you send pages, and then she quickly responded with a letter that said, call me, and then I called her, and she said, how did you not put your phone number on this package? And I said, well, Google didn't tell me to put my phone number. Google said that would be presumptuous. And so nowadays, I think all of the big New York agencies have very good websites, and they're very clear about what they're looking for and what they call a query. And so you have to have a good letter that sort of explains why you wrote the book that you did. You have to have written the entire novel as an unknown. I think I'm luckier than most in writing a query letter, because once you say you're a doctor who then wrote this story, that's just weird enough that it makes people pay attention. And then their website will tell you exactly how many words they want to consider. And so they then are sort of looking at 10,000 words, say. So those 10,000 words have to be very good. And then if they're interested, they'll let you know and ask for the whole manuscript. And then if they're interested in that, they'll let you know they want to represent you. And so I was actually, I reached out to, back in the day, had worked with Charlotte Sheedy, who is Ali Sheedy's mom, and quite lovely. And she had a minion at the time named Kirby Kim, and Kirby had gone on to work elsewhere. And so I had taken just a very long break, not doing anything besides sort of surviving my children's younger years. And so when I wrote this book, I tracked down Kirby's agency, and my husband was like, you should just email him directly because he knows you. And I said, well, that was 10 years ago. I'm going to do what the website says. And so there was this horrible 24-hour period where I sent out the query letter, did mention that we had worked together in the past, before he sort of got in touch and said, just send me the whole thing. And I said, sure. And then, I was lucky enough to have him be just like an amazing editor. And so by the time we were ready to send the manuscript out, he had sort of fixed a lot of my typos and the bits that didn't make sense. And so we were actually in pretty good shape. And I think he sent it out, I don't know to exactly how many people, but I got on the phone about 24 hours later and talked to Jenny Knopf, and then we got an offer the next day, which, was great, but also led me to believe for a long period of time that she was just probably insane, and maybe terrifyingly like the only one who had read the book. And so for a very long time I was like, maybe it's not good. Like maybe it's just like Kirby and Jenny and I are in this delusion where no one else has been a part of this decision. And it was a really bad idea to take a chance on this. But then I became aware that in order for them to actually make you an offer, like people read it. And the fellow who is the editor-in-chief at both Knopf and Doubleday, his name is Sunny Meadow, which I did not know at the time that Kirby called and was like, Sunny Meadow read your book. And I was like, what is that? And I'm trying to Google at the same time and seem cool, but I'm not cool. And so it didn't go over well. But he's apparently quite famous for sort of having an eye for balance. And so this is not a Pulitzer Prize winner or a Nobel Prize winner, but he has a lot of those types of people on their roles. And then he also bought 50 Shades of Grey, which I think financed all of the art. And so it's really interesting to sort of look at the industry and sort of say, how does any of this work, and how do we get books to people that are going to make a difference but still pay the bills. And so I appreciate they're taking a chance on Essie, and just it's been an amazing learning experience. Yeah, any questions before we wrap up?
Well, I think you've left us with a lot of hope this evening, and for the industry and for people just spending time reading and just learning through the medium of books. So that is really comforting to hear that. And I thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and for coming all the way out here this evening to talk to us.
Thank you. And
if anybody has a book that would like it signed, I'm sure Megan will be happy to do so. And there are copies available as well through Book Lovers Gourmet if you're interested in purchasing one. And so we have about a half an hour if people would like to linger and chat. And thank you again, Megan, for coming all the way.
Thank you so much.